dialogue and presentations on a variety of issues affecting young people today and how parents can work with their children to try to resolve some of these issues and to make a better life for everyone. We have several speakers here tonight to talk about this really important issue of opioid and addiction. And our first speaker tonight, I'm going to introduce to you, will be Mr. Stephen Baker. He's Chief of the Criminal Division at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Michigan. He has been a federal prosecutor for 12 years, first in Chicago and now in Grand Rapids. He has investigated and tried numerous narcotic cases involving international and local drug trafficking. Please welcome Stephen Baker.
Thank you all. It is an honor to be with you here this evening. As a federal prosecutor, in my professional capacity, I'm very conscious of the fact that people never really want to meet me. And so it makes me pretty astute at giving bad news. And so for the segment of our presentation this evening, I'm the bad news segment. I will give you the hope segments that follow. And I am honored to be up here with these people who I've known now for 3 years with the Foundation of Families Against Narcotics. And all the things that they have done to further the opportunities for families of those suffering from substance abuse disorder and those individuals who are suffering from addiction, and all the opportunities they've given them. So it is a very hopeful presentation we will round out with. But as I tell you, what I'm going to give you is the scope of the problem that we have not only across the country, but particularly here to West Michigan, where I work and where I prosecute cases and my office prosecutes cases. It is not new news to any of you, I'm sure, or to our community that the opioid crisis is an epidemic for us, and it is causing serious ill. It was slowly recognized by my offices, the federal government in all its capacities, in the CDC, though they were reporting on it for a long time. It was only, this quote here is from 2016, but the Department of Health and Human Services, as you will see from some of the litigation going on in the United States these days, we are only now holding some of the pharmaceutical companies that have given rise to a great deal of this problem historically in our country accountable financially for what's going on. But there are waves of this problem, and the current wave we're dealing with, I'm sorry to say, is even more dangerous than the historical one where people were not aware of what they were getting into. The Surgeon General has made this point with doctors, former head of the FDA saying that this was the biggest mistake made in modern medicine, the release of opioids. But I will tell you that as of 2017, there are still 192 Americans that die every year from overdoses related to opioids. If you talk to Dr. Kappinga, who will be up here in a second, she will talk about in recovery, we talk about there being 3 waves of the opioid crisis. The first being those presented in the 1990s by pharmaceuticals and the availability of drugs like OxyContin, where people were getting addicted before they realized what they were up to, and doctors prescribing them before they realized the danger. It wasn't publicized the way it should be. The next range was in the 2010s when people began to remove those drugs, heroin took over. And then following that, the synthetic opioids, and we're talking about fentanyl and carfentanil. And I will tell you that the danger of the drugs that are available in terms of their potency has only increased over time. While there is increased awareness that a lot of these folks have worked on and that we have tried to do and that you've probably heard about, the danger of the drugs that are provided is that much stronger. And as we look at things now, you look at the rise of synthetic opioids in terms of their distribution. These are drugs that are 60 to 100 times more potent than the heroin people would buy on the street. And users, individual folks suffering from addiction, don't know what they're getting. And that is what we battle all the time in the criminal attitude. Several folks will talk about how the 4th phase of the opioid crisis is not even a narcotic drug, and that is methamphetamine. And I will tell you right now that in my office, what I see, and for the law enforcement members that might be in the room as well, what you see as well is crystal meth has flooded West Michigan. And you might not think of that as related to opioids, but for the people I deal with, in terms of people who are suffering from substance abuse disorder, many of them are just looking to be well for a day. And they're looking for a way not to feel the withdrawal symptoms. And I will tell you, if you think the pharmaceutical companies of the United States and across the world that have exploited this crisis to make a great deal of money are opportunistic, you should see the Mexican drug cartels that produce drugs. And what I will tell you is that synthetic opioids, while being more potent, are also cheaper to manufacture than it is to grow opium, and therefore make heroin and manufacture heroin. So fentanyl is something they can make for much cheaper and distribute in smaller amounts in larger potency. And methamphetamine is even cheaper than that. So what you're seeing is a corrupt criminal enterprise that is exploiting a need, a very substantive need by users throughout the United States, and particularly in West Michigan. And we see crystal meth in pound quantities in a way that this region has never dealt with in the last several decades, now on a regular basis through areas throughout, and that's available and cheap. And these are meth seizures only at the border that you see as reported in 2018 in the New York Times. They have skyrocketed. And we see a great deal of such seizures through not only border crossings where you would expect them, but through the mail. The dark web has opened an entire portal for individuals to get a hold of drugs that otherwise they might not have known how to find. And the drive of the use of their addiction will cause them to order and ask for things and process things in individual members. And I'm talking about children still in junior high or high school, and older young people under their 20s and 30s, people who've suffered addiction a long time, who are after a high that they can no longer get in an area they can no longer find. And the mail has given them a great portal to this because you're talking about very small amounts. So we deal with seizures like that all the time, and crystal meth particularly. Over 70,000 people died of opioid and drug overdoses in 2017 in America. And some of that we're seeing plateau because of the availability of antidotes like Narcan, but we're still seeing the use surge. And so the danger is becoming even stronger through methamphetamine, which may not kill people through use, but causes different dangers in terms of violence or different storms. Stimulants are different from narcotics, and so methamphetamine has its own ills. More numbers, overdoses rose. So even though we're seeing treatment for overdoses, and maybe people are not suffering the ultimate sacrifice in their death, we're seeing more overdoses historically, and that has to do with the potency of the drugs people are using. I will say that in West Michigan, none of the law enforcement officers I work with see any heroin that doesn't have fentanyl in it anymore. And fentanyl is a drug that's 60 times more potent than heroin on its granular basis. People are spiking their drugs so they don't have to buy as many of them in order to sell them to people who will use them on the street. The Midwest is suffering particularly, and Michigan is part of this suffering. Our overdose rates are up 70%. And you'll see those, our trends are even higher than they are on the coast, and some of that is because we've been slower to react to them. And this is true of young people, and the forgotten fact of this too, we think of children who were exposed to dangerous drugs, but it's also true of people around the middle age and the elderly, because there is an entire component of our society that has been exposed to prescription drugs and have become addicted over time. And they are no less vulnerable to the need, when those prescriptions are cut off, to fill that need in terms of their substance abuse. Michigan particularly, you'll see the numbers in terms of prescriptions and overdose rates very much the same. This from the Department of Health and Human Services shows our rates continue to rise in Michigan through 2017 and have been consistent despite the fact that Narcan has been available in terms of overdose amounts within the state. It's one of the highest prescribing rates in the United States. That's 74.2 prescriptions for every 100 citizens in our state. 2 opioids. Those are still prescription drugs that are being prescribed in 2017. These on the red spots are some of the highest amounts of overdoses per citizen, and Michigan still tends to rise within the Midwest, which has been a very vulnerable area in the United States over time, in Ohio and Kentucky, West Virginia, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin as well. And our overdose death rate has increased 13.9% between 2016 and 2017. Some of that has plateaued. Narcan is more available, thank goodness, in terms of its ability to counteract those overdoses, but it hasn't slowed the number of people who are using or the overdoses they've experienced. And some counties within our state are still prescribing more opioids per person than there are people within the counties. And some of that is a lack of education, but some of it is just the available drugs in terms of the doctors that are there. And overdose deaths in 2017 within Michigan exceeded traffic and gun deaths combined. Within Kent County, in 2018, the last year that the medical examiner reported amounts, there were 28 homicides within the county. There were 114 deaths due to overdose. It's almost 5 times as many. This is true by opioids and other drugs as well, but you see the increase from 1999 to 2016. And the same thing is true for hospital admissions. So even though deaths may be curbing, overdose amounts are increasing. This is the cause of death within first mention for Kent County in 2016. There was 93, but in 2017 we were up to 156. Now, as I mentioned, that came down. It was 118 in 2018, but those numbers are still far too high. That is the bad news about what I'm seeing. What I'm about to give you now is some of the hope. And the first person I'm going to introduce you to is my colleague, Dr. Jean Kappinga. And she came to Grand Rapids to offer hope now 4 years ago as we sat down. And Dr. Kappinga came in, and what she wanted to found was something that you'll hear throughout the evening has been very successful. That is Families Against Narcotics, in terms of not only spreading this information, but offering an outlet for families where they can go when there wasn't support for those who were suffering along with those who suffered from substance abuse disorder. Dr. Kappinga was originally, in her professional career, her first professional career, an anesthesiologist. She found that very fulfilling enough that she retired, and fulfilling enough that she got very bored when she retired. So now, what Dr. Kappinga does is she treats addiction. She's not only in recovery, but she also does practicing addiction work for the last 5 years. She is board eligible in that practice, her second board eligibility, and she has a full range of treatments, including medically assisted treatments in the form of methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. But that is only her professional work. What I will tell you is she cares a great deal, and I know she cares a great deal because I've seen her do it, and that in the form of recovery for individuals, and more particularly families within West Michigan for the last 3 years with Families Against Narcotics. She has been foundational at spreading medically assisted and recovery treatment in the jails of West Michigan in several different jurisdictions, but she has been even more foundational, and she is the president of our local fan chapter, and she is a good friend of mine. And I appreciate that she was here, and she can tell you a lot more hopeful things than I have. So I give you Dr. Jean Kappinga.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks, Steve. It's a wonderful summary of where we were and where we're at now with the opioid epidemic. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Scheibler and the entire Rockford community for inviting us here this evening and for hosting this event. Dr. Scheibler, you're truly a visionary in understanding the complexity of this crisis and trying to develop programming for healthier kids. So thank you. We enjoy the collaborative spirit. First off, I'd like to have people raise hands for who has been affected by drug addiction or having a loved one who's been affected by it, and then who has suffered loss to an overdose. Thank you. I'm a physician in addiction medicine, as Steve mentioned, and then also working in the jail system. My specialty area is treatment courts, trying to get people that have been in the legal system treatment rather than just being arrested. I'm a consultant for Medicaid part-time through this opioid epidemic, but most gratifying is serving as president of the Families Against Narcotics chapter. It's been very wonderful seeing the chapter develop over these past several years. We now have 20 chapters in Michigan and a couple more. We rounded off to about 24 because there's always more information, as well as several chapters that are in other states throughout the nation. So the template that we use is to bring everybody that's involved in the different sectors, community leaders, physicians, law enforcement, judicial, anybody to the tables to open up the conversation to talk about drug addiction so that it's treated like the medical disease that it is. By bringing people to the table in each community, we can devise solutions together so that it works personally for that community. We like to have open and honest and healthy conversations, and we train people at our meetings how to talk about it, just as you would talk about diabetes or blood pressure or even cancer. By opening up the conversations, we choose to allow people who are needing help the opportunity to get it without the stigma, without the fear or shame of embarrassment when they need help. The board members here are from what we call our Fan Central chapter, the inaugural chapter that started 12 or 13 years ago in Macomb County. FAN is a Michigan-based 501c3 that began in a church basement with about 100 people getting together that were recognizing in Macomb County that some of their youths were dying of drug overdoses and starting to look at solutions in making a change so that their community would not be involved with more unnecessary deaths. We've created a number of templates for rolling out in the different chapters to personalize to each community, using the people in the community, because each community has its own personality and has different resources and different needs. One of the programs we are highlighting is Hope Not Handcuffs, which is a successful program beginning several years ago, where we've enrolled over 3,000 people. A person who wishes treatment presents themselves to a law enforcement agency. One of our volunteers comes to meet with them and sit with them, and then starts a process to get them into treatment within a couple hours, or certainly less than a day, so that we can meet them at the point of engagement to get them into treatment when they're ready for it, which is crucial for starting a successful recovery program. We're also very involved with school education programs such as this, and we're developing more programming as time goes by, and that's one of the reasons Judge Davis is here tonight to share with us some of that education. Our Grand Rapids board, it consists of these individuals, and you might know, well, obviously Mike Emery, and then Jane Dykema from here, and then Chris Becker is our county prosecutor, and all of us, this is a working board, we're all volunteers, so we do everything ourselves, and we're all very involved. When we meet, we come up with great ideas that we get from our audience for needs, and then we actually have to create that resource, because there's not a playbook for this epidemic. It's creating everything that the audience needs, because there's nothing out there at this time. 2 years ago, we presented an awareness panel right here in the same auditorium with the Rockford folks again. And it was termed the worst man-made epidemic known to mankind from the CDC. In 2017, as Steve alluded to, we were experiencing a drug overdose death every other day. And it was the highest suicide rate in this county ever. And Kent County was the #1 organ donor for the county for the entire state of Michigan due to the opioid epidemic. And those are all numbers from the medical examiner. In 2018, our numbers show that we're now having a drug overdose death every 3 days now, approximately, in Kent County. And so we're now moving 2 years later from, instead of just raising awareness, to actually doing an action plan, doing specific educational programming and other outreach presentations. There is still much work to be done. Please visit our website, www.familiesagainstnarcotics.org. Look for Grand Rapids under locations. We have a monthly meeting the first Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. We have an educational speaker as well as a chance for resources there. All are welcome, and it is free. How many people here have actually been to a fan meeting in Grand Rapids? Good. How many people here have a Narcan kit at home? Oh, we need to see a few more hands up next time we ask that question. If you aren't aware, Narcan is the antidote to an opioid overdose. It does not work on meth or benzos or cocaine. There is what's termed a collaborative practice agreement now in Michigan where you can just go to a pharmacy and ask the pharmacist for a Narcan kit. You don't need a prescription at all. So I highly encourage everybody to try and get a kit in your house or in your car. You just never know when you're going to come across someone with a drug overdose. If you want more resources, we have our table out in the lobby, and I encourage you to sign up for emails so you get on our email blast list for any of the special events that we have. On October 26th is a National DEA Drug Take Back Day. We traditionally partner with our friends, Dr. Fawcett and the Spectrum Group, over at the Whitcomb building, so from 10 till 2, swing by, clean out your medicine cabinets, get rid of those drugs that are just sitting around, in the hopes that you'll prevent the gateway to drug addiction by getting rid of those drugs so others don't start their addiction just by going to someone's medicine cabinet. The only other piece of advice I can give you as a physician is to learn as much as you possibly can about this disease, just as you would if you had diabetes or blood pressure problems. There's a lot out there, and the more you learn about it, the more you'll understand and be able to cope with how the disease process works, but also to learn how the treatments work and feel more comfortable with communicating with your loved one who may be affected. Tonight's presentation is on Danger of the Game, the gateway into opioid addiction through prescription drug treatment of athletic injuries. And I am pleased and honored to introduce the Executive Director of FAN, Judge Linda Davis, as a friend, an ardent voice for these past many years for combating this epidemic, and for her own personal support of our chapter. A Michigan native, Judge Davis began her career teaching school and then became an attorney. She was the Macomb County prosecutor for about 10 years and then was appointed to the 42B Macomb District Court in 2000 and successfully created the template model for a drug treatment court there and has treated hundreds of successful people in recovery there. She early retired earlier this year from the bench so that she could devote all of her time and expertise to helping people and in directing FAN to this next level as we enter this new decade next year. It's not unusual for her to have breakfast in Detroit, lunch in Grand Rapids, and dinner in Traverse City. She does get around the state quite a bit, and I think she had quite an event last night in Macomb County as a show of support for FAN's efforts, and I'll let her share that success with you when she talks. She has a lengthy bio with numerous awards for her stellar achievements. Her recent opioid activities include being named the chairman of the Michigan Prescription Drug and Opioid Abuse Commission by Governor Snyder from 2016 to 2018. That commission developed 57 different legislative bills that were passed to address the opioid epidemic at a statewide level. She's also testified in front of Congress and the White House Commission on Opioid Addiction 5 times, so is recognized as a national leader in this epidemic as well. Currently, the one thing that you'll be seeing here at the educational level is the implementation in 2020 of the mandatory school curriculum covering opioid addiction, similar to the concussion type education. So that is all through her efforts as chairing the Michigan Commission. So she's easily the best public speaker I have ever seen on this topic, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing her message of hope this evening. Please join me in giving Judge Davis a warm West Michigan welcome.
And I particularly love speaking about this topic because it's something that's very near and dear to me. I think to understand why I'm here tonight, you need to understand a little bit about my history and what brought me here. As Jean indicated, I started out my career as a school teacher, and I'm going to relate my entire career to the drug problem that we have here today, because I want you to know that you are probably looking at one of the biggest problems in our society for how addiction is looked at. When I was teaching high school, I was one of the younger teachers, and so I got laid off a lot. It was during the baby boomer time, and population was going down, so I would work one year, get laid off the next, work one year, get laid off the next. And so I oftentimes would be assigned jobs in the school system that nobody else wanted to teach. And of course, I would say yes to those because I wanted to be employed. And one of those jobs was teaching an alternative ed program. And I had 15 students in that class that were all part of this problem. They were kids that had been kicked out of the school system for either drug use, drug abuse, had gone to jail, and had lots of problems that they brought with them. I will tell you that I was terrified to teach that class. I had knives pulled on me. My life was threatened in the very beginning of it numerous times. But by the end of the year that I taught that class, I ended up thinking more of those kids than I did any other kids that I had ever taught in my 13-year career as a school teacher. Even though they had a vast array of drug problems, they were incredibly respectful once I earned their trust. And they became my bodyguards, where no one could say anything bad about me because they would come to my defense. And it was apparent to me that giving a little bit of care to those kids went a very long way. You would have think that being the intelligent woman that I am, that would have really put off a light bulb in my head that maybe people with addictions aren't really such bad people at all, but it didn't. So then I became a prosecutor. I eventually got laid off and did not get called back, so I went to law school, became a lawyer, and became a prosecutor as my first job in that career. At my job, I was assigned the drug unit, and so I prosecuted all of the major drug cases in our county. And I handled very big cases, and I oftentimes would handle very mediocre cases about people that use drugs. And I was very proud of my conviction rate. I would lock people up without even thinking about it. I would have parents sitting in the back of my courtroom crying. And I never once gave a thought to what I was doing to those families. I thought people that used drugs were bad people, they were morally inept, and that they deserved to be in jail, and that I was doing all of you a big favor by getting them out of your neighborhoods. And then I became a judge. And I carried that same attitude into my judgeship. And I was considered a very good judge, but I incarcerated lots of people that had the disease of addiction because I thought they were bad people with bad problems. And that once again, I was keeping our community safe. And then about 14 years ago, I was getting ready to go on a weekend trip, and I was awakened by my young daughter in her bedroom crying. My daughter's a beautiful young girl, and she was a straight-A student. She was an athlete. She did competitive cheerleading. She traveled all over the nation and won many trophies for her ability in doing what I call one of the hardest sports I've ever seen, and that's competitive cheer. And she had been accepted at 4 different colleges that she applied to. She was a senior. And I really thought that life was really good. I had gone to parent-teacher conference, was told what a wonderful young daughter I had raised, that she was so polite to adults, got along with kids her own age, was doing great in all of her classes, was still maintaining straight A average. And I walked out of parent-teacher conference thinking, wow, we dodged all the bullets. She's graduating, she's going to college, she's going to become the president of the United States, and I had all these incredible, incredible visions of where her life was going because she had unbelievable abilities. And then I was awakened one night in the middle of the night, and I heard her crying, and I went into her room to find out what was going on. And she disclosed to me that she had news to tell me that was going to make me hate her. And I indicated to her that wasn't possible, and This is a very lengthy story because it was a 2-hour conversation, and I'm not going to bore you with all of it, but when we started this conversation, I really thought that she was going to tell me she was pregnant. She had started dating a young guy that I did not like. I probably wouldn't have liked any young guy that my daughter dated, but I didn't like this one particularly. And we had discussions about it. Never fights, but we had discussions about it. And I was sure that she was going to tell me that. And I was mortified by that thought because I had visions for this child, and I could see her life being derailed. And so as we continued to talk in the morning, the story unfolded. And 2 hours later, when she started getting very sick, violently sick, she disclosed to me that she was addicted to heroin. And I will tell you that I felt like I got sucker punched. Here I do addiction for a living, and I had no idea that this was going on in my own house. The thing about opiate addiction is that you can maintain stability for a period of time on it, but then you can't. And she was at the point where she couldn't. There were signs that if I had known a little bit about addiction, I may have been more intuitively looking for these kind of things, but I truly did not think this could happen in my family. I'm what I would call a great mom. I've always been very involved with my children, and I thought that's what it took. You know, that if you just did all the right things as a parent, you showed up at all their conferences, you went to all their activities, you were there at dinner time, and you sat down and you talked to them, and you took them to church on Sunday, and we had Sunday dinners together as a family on a regular basis, that these kind of things would not happen to a family like that. And I was naive and ignorant, and I did not understand the disease of addiction. What had happened is 6 months prior to that, my daughter had surgery on her knee. She tore one of the tendons in her knee when she was doing competitive cheerleading. And she was prescribed Vicodin. And being the good mom that I am, every 4 hours I made her take it. And in essence, I was her first drug dealer right along with her doctor. I did not realize, nobody told me when they gave me that bottle of pills that many years ago, that those were as strong as heroin, that they were a synthetic form of it, and that if she took them for more than a couple of days, that she would become dependent on them, and eventually would develop an addiction if her brain was wired that way. We did notice very subtle changes almost immediately in her behavior, but you have subtle changes with medication, and it was nothing that was so alarming. But we did notice that there were changes in her behavior. She didn't turn into a bad kid. I don't think her addiction developed overnight, but she certainly became dependent on these drugs. And we could see a progression of that she was not spending time at home as much. But all of these are things that you expect your teenager to do naturally. She was hanging out with friends more, staying over at her boyfriend's house after school more, coming home always on time, never broke curfew, was sleepy a lot. Teenagers are sleepy a lot. She slept in the morning. Teenagers do that too. She wanted to spend less and less time with me, which hurt my feelings, but that's what teenagers do, is they don't need their parents as much and they move away from you, and you want them to do that. It's a healthy thing if it's for the right reasons. And all of those things on hindsight, even if I knew them at the time, would not have pointed to addiction. The one thing that I do say that if I had known a little bit more about it is that her hygiene changed. She didn't take care of herself the way she did before. She didn't wash her hair as frequently, and she lost a ton of weight. All of those things are signs that an addiction may be going on, not always, but that there's certainly something that should alert you. And if I was really honest with you, in my gut, I knew things weren't quite right, but I never in my wildest imagination would have thought that heroin addiction was lurking in our home. I'm a strong woman. I did not break down and cry, and I know that sounds amazing to you because I wanted to, but I knew that we were in a crisis mode and that what she needed was support and help, not a blubbering mother. So I kept it together. I started making phone calls to all of the wonderful facilities that I referred to people to as a judge, And it was amazing how inept they were at providing any kind of resource or help for me whatsoever. Not only was I told repeatedly that I'm sorry, there's no help here for you. She's 17 years old, she's not an adult, she's not a child, so she didn't fit in adolescent treatment programs, which were non-existent back then anyhow, and she didn't fit into an adult program. I don't know what to tell you, I don't know where to send you. And that was the message that I got. But the bigger message was that at the end of that phone conversation, number one, I was never treated respectfully on those phone conversations. And secondly, I was always told at the end of those conversations, and you need to brace yourself because she's probably going to die. And I will tell you, I already had fear off the chart, and those words were like taking a knife and sticking in my heart. I looked at my young daughter, this beautiful young girl that I was so proud of, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to die. How do I stop that? And I was in panic mode. So I eventually just put her in the car, and I sat on the board of one of our local hospitals at the time. And I took her to their emergency room, and they said, oh, well, we don't detox here. We can't accept her. The liability is too great. So I called the CEO of the hospital, and I said, you need to call your emergency room and tell them they are going to admit my daughter. And I never used the judge card. I'm not someone that likes to be called judge. I don't have, that isn't my identity. I'm just a person just like you. I never call restaurants and say, I'm a judge. Can I get a reservation when you're full? That's just not who I am. But this time, my daughter was going to die, and I was going to use whatever card I could play to make sure that we got her help. So I got her into the hospital, and they hooked her up to all kinds of IVs and fluids. And the doctor very, very bluntly told me, you know, we're just going to try to keep her comfortable. We don't really know what to do here, but we'll try to keep her as comfortable as we can. So they did that. And I was very, very appreciative at the time for that happening because I needed time. I needed to buy time to find out where I was going to send her. And so I started, I walked out into the hallway, and that was the first time, and I was dressed in sweats. I did not look like I do now. My hair wasn't combed. I had on no makeup. It was a sight, believe me. And so I walked out into the hallway to call my secretary to let her know that I was going to be taking the next week off. And it was the first time that morning that when I told my secretary, who is very much like a sister to me, that I wasn't going to be in because my child was suffering from a heroin addiction, that I actually broke down and cried. And I was standing in the hallway, and that's 14 years ago. And if you think this isn't painful for parents, I still have difficulty getting those words out, obviously without breaking down and getting teary-eyed about it. I was scared, and so I was sobbing and trying to tell my secretary, Louise, what was going on and why I was going to be off so long. And I heard a doctor and a nurse standing at the nurse's station, and the doctor looked at me and said to the nurse, look at that pathetic mom crying over that junkie kid. And I'm going to tell you, I don't think I've ever felt that kind of shame in my life. But it was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me because I knew that once I got this issue somewhat under control and that I had a game plan, that I was going to be part of what changed the system and changed what happened. Now, I'll tell you, I felt a lot of guilt for a lot of reasons. I felt guilt over not seeing this addiction quicker. I felt guilt over a lot of things, but one of the hardest things that I've had to deal with is how many families I've treated exactly that same way. And I'll own that because I think we all need to own our part in the world of addiction and how we keep that stigma going. I was just talking to the young man who's filming this today that came from TV4, and I said, you're doing a really positive story on this. Don't make the mistake that all media makes and take this really positive story of hope tonight and turn it into a stigma piece when you go back and you start editing it by showing the person under the bridge with the needle in their arm and all the negative things we think about addiction when you put this positive story on the air, because we're conditioned to think about addiction in that way. I really struggled with that. Like, how did I get so biased? How did I get so callous? And I got that way very legitimately. It's what I was educated to believe. It's every TV show we see. We don't see the hope of recovery. We see the throes of addiction. We even did it in our own literature. As Jean indicated to you, we started this really positive program called Hope Not Handcuffs. It gives hope to people. And we're reaching out saying, walk in, we'll help you, no questions asked. No matter what your addiction, I don't care if it's benzos, amphetamines, methamphetamine, alcohol, heroin, fentanyl, whatever you're addicted to, we want to help you. And so you walk into a police department and you say, I'm sick, I need help. We send an angel, we send a peer recovery coach, we give your family a family coach. It's one of the most positive things I've ever done in my life. But our brochure had a person all humped over sad on the front of it. So we remarketed everything when we realized how we were playing into the stigma of addiction. And now we have someone standing on a mountain with their arms outstretched that is getting their life back, and it's a positive take on it. And we need to think about that. Think of the language we use to talk about addiction. We tell people that fail a drug test, you're dirty. You're dirty. We don't tell somebody when they have cancer cells in their body, you're dirty. You know, you came back, you're positive for cancer, you're filthy. And that's what we tell drug addicts on a regular basis. We call them names, we call them addicts. We don't make up names for people that have cancer and call them a negative name because they have cancer. And it might surprise you to know how the two of those diseases mirror themselves so much alike. Like we feel sympathy when someone says, your child has cancer. It's like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Someone says, my child has an addiction, they're addicted to heroin, and it's like, whoa, wonder what's wrong with that family. We really discriminate against people that have addiction, and it's the biggest block to treatment that you can possibly imagine. People are shamed so badly. I can't tell you the shame I felt that day when I was standing in that hospital, and I thought, how do you break that? We're so conditioned to think that about people. We do positive stories about Narcan training, and Narcan is not the solution, but it's a piece of it. Narcan is a drug that you can use to bring somebody out of an overdose, and it saves their life. And it gives an ambulance time to get there and take them to a hospital where you hope that they will continue to get help there. But every time we post positive stories about doing Narcan trainings or anything, we get these ignorant comments like, just let them die. Why are we wasting taxpayer dollars on Narcan? You know, they made the choice, just let them die. Let them die, let them die. And that's the message that people with addiction hear all the time, that they are not worthy of help, that they are not worthy of resources. And so we need to change that. And we just produced a new video that aired last night. And if you go to our website, by Monday, it will be on the website. And I really encourage you to watch that, because what we did is we took all those negatives about Narcan and we tried to spin it into a message of hope on why we should want to give somebody Narcan. We would never say to somebody who had cancer, well, you have cancer, and I'm sorry, but you smoked, so we're just going to let you die, because you brought that on yourself. We don't lose our compassion with any other disease other than addiction. And I'll show you the biggest one. Do all of you remember the Ebola scare we had a year or so back? Anybody? Okay, yes, heads are shaking. We lost 0 people in the United States from Ebola in this country. I think one person came in from another country that did eventually die, but nobody in the United States got Ebola. Do you know how many billions of dollars were spent on protocols for what if Ebola comes into our hospital? We had protocols almost overnight dealing with that. And yet we are losing 72,000 people a year to addiction. And hospitals are just now starting to deal with this issue. If you want to talk about stigma, that sums it up in a nutshell. And we need to demand more. We need to demand better, because people can get well. People can find recovery. One of the things as parents and young people that you need to understand is that a very large percentage of young people become addicted accidentally. I believe that and no matter what article you read, statistics change with whatever article you read. So I'm going to give you the low and the high. Between 78 and 83% of young people who become addicted to substances become addicted because of a legal prescription that was written. And those prescriptions are oftentimes written because of sports injuries. And the other big reason that young people get addicted is because of wisdom teeth being pulled. That's what you're sent home with, is Vicodin. I'm proud to say that last night when we did our big fundraiser for FAN in Macomb County, we had several dental groups that showed up and supported our event. And they paid big money to be there. And one of the young dentists came up, and I remember that when I was sitting down and educating him, and anybody that works with me will tell you that I don't mince a lot of words. People are dying. We don't have time to play nice in the sand. We either need to be all in or all out, but we need to start making some real changes here, quit talking about the problem, and come up with an action plan. And so we decided we were going to get all the dentists together because they were prescribing to kids, and we wanted to educate them. And there was a young oral surgeon that came to that program, and he told me off and walked out of the room, and he says, you know what? I resent that you're not even a doctor and you're telling me what I should do with my patients. I said, I'm not telling you what to do with your patients. I'm telling you to just think before you pick up a prescription pad. That's all I'm asking you to do, is just think, is this something I really need to give this person? And if it is, write the script. Well, I hadn't seen him for 2 years. I did this presentation 2 years ago. And he came up to me. I got seated with him at a function right before Christmas last year. And he said, do you remember me? And I said, oh, yeah, and I'm sure you remember me. And he said, yes. And he said, I wanted to thank you. He said, you know, I was so mad at you that night, but when I went to pick up that prescription pad the next day, I could not write that script. And he said, not only did I change my prescribing, but our entire group changed their prescribing. And we added it up, and in that 1 year, we decreased the amount of opiates we were writing by 1 million pills. 1 million pills from one presentation. So yes, I made somebody angry that night, but it changed their behavior. And that's what we need to do, is start changing behavior. So when I learned that how many kids were getting addicted, and my own daughter was affected because of a sports injury, I thought, why aren't schools doing that kind of education right along with concussion education? So we decided that we were going to present a video that we would try to get played in all schools. And we are going to play that video at this time, and then I will close with some remarks and then answer any questions that you might have later on with the panel.
Pop. I felt it pop. I knew that immediately something happened, and it turned out that I tore my rotator cuff and partially tore my labrum, and it required surgery. So when they discharged me, I had 90 Percocets, and this was in 2006. I had never experienced a Percocet or any sort of opiate at that time, but discharging a person like me with 90 Percocets was the worst thing that could have ever happened. I had no idea what was about to happen, but it was the beginning of a very long journey.
So my first injury was during basketball season. I dove for a loose ball and I twisted my knee and kind of tried to walk it off and noticed something felt funny. So I went to the doctor, they did an MRI, and I had a torn meniscus. While I was in high school, and shortly after, I had another 2 surgeries, so I always had prescriptions around. It was pretty readily available.
From the time he was probably, I would say, 8, 9 years old, he played baseball, basketball, Then he got into football in high school. Just loved football. He played it for 2 years. In 2008, he got an injury. He fractured his ankle and pulled a hamstring. He went to the doctor, and of course, you know, like any doctor, they have to do something for the pain, so he thought, okay. I had no problem with it. At that time, I didn't know, you know, about opiates or anything like that. So I gave him medication, let him do it on his own. You know, he's 16 years old. The pills were running out very quickly. So he's, Mom, you know, I'm in pain. I need to go back to the doctor. I take him back to the doctor, of course. Doctor prescribes another prescription with no problem.
We know that teens and adolescents don't have fully formed brains, and so some of the control centers of the brain and some of the centers of the brain that help with thought and processing and also reward the idea of how high or how good you feel from a substance aren't fully formed in the brain, and exposures to substances, including alcohol, tobacco, but opioids as well, even though these are prescription medications, have the potential to lead a young adult towards higher rates of addiction later in life.
And the injuries that soccer had given me, you know, by the time I was in 8th grade, I was already prescribed Vicodin. By the time I was a sophomore, I was being prescribed morphine, and you know, that eventually that chemical addiction just took over.
I played football and I wrestled, and I was a great football player, and I was a varsity football player by the time I was 16 years old, and I got an injury and the doctor prescribed me Vicodin. And as a result of being prescribed Vicodin, I picked up this addiction, and I was addicted to pills, and I was a kid.
Perception of risk was really low because it was prescribed by a doctor, so I didn't see any reason why I couldn't take it whenever I felt the need to take it.
Looking at that picture, knowing that I just took the first pill and there was 89 more like in my pocket, if she would have known that there was this thing, this little plastic container with just destructive pills inside, she probably would have just burned the entire thing. She had no idea, and I certainly didn't have an idea either, that the next 10 years of our lives were going to be heartache. One turned into two, and the tolerance then went up because my body became dependent on that, and two then wasn't enough for pleasure, so I had to do 4, and within a week the pills were gone. And the pills should have lasted me for, I don't know, a month, 2 months, something like that. So, and I remember the day after I was done with the pills, my body was already hooked. I was already experiencing withdrawal symptoms, and it was not a good feeling.
Cody lived on the streets. He lived in abandoned buildings. He robbed drug dealers. He did everything he possibly could to get his hands on heroin. That morning, my husband phoned him. My son swallowed all the packets of heroin. Died instantly, according to what they're telling me. He ingested enough heroin, and take that bag of heroin and fentanyl. The fentanyl was enough to kill 15 people.
I was just all about pills. That's all I wanted to do, because I needed them. I had to have them. I went from being, you know, this, what I would think is a good kid that grew up in a good neighborhood, that had loving parents, that never experienced, you know, trauma or neglect or drug abuse, that had a wonderful opportunity at success, that went to, you know, good schools, that could have been a Major League Baseball player. But here I am, like this guy that had all of that, and now
I wanted to say that you look at all of these kids, the young kid that had the bright blue shirt on in there, his name was Cody. And I remember when Cody first came to FAN, he told me, he said, You know, I was the kind of kid that I did not drink or do marijuana, but when a doctor prescribed me the pills and they made me feel good, I thought, wow, I can feel good and I don't have to do anything illegal and unhealthy. And there's this perception that if a doctor writes it, it must be good for you. And people don't choose to be addicts. It's something that happens to them. It rewires their brain. It changes the chemistry in their brain. And the desire to use will do things like cause people to abandon their children. It's amazing to me the strength of addiction once it takes hold. And I think that's something that young people can't really relate to, is that, you know, it's a rite of passage to experiment, to break the rules that your parents set up for you. Back when I was a kid, and I'm going to age myself, we didn't have a lot of drugs around, but drinking was the cool thing to do when you were a kid. And we would all sneak out, and kids would do, not me, but a lot of kids would sneak out and they would drink and, you know, sneak home at night. And then the next thing that came onto the market was marijuana. And then it became the hallucinogenics. And then it became cocaine. And then it became crack cocaine and ecstasy. And unfortunately, what's happened now is that the drugs that kids are experimenting with right off the bat are powerful enough that you can't just walk away from them. A lot of the things that I've mentioned before, not to say that they're good and you should go experiment with them, but they were things that you could go out and party with occasionally, you could have a couple of drinks, and eventually when you grew up and decided you wanted to get serious about life, you could leave those things away alone. But the drugs that kids are experimenting with now are so powerful, they're so potent, that once they grab hold of you, walking away isn't an easy option, and it takes a lot of work. And although young people don't have a long history of use, and that's a good thing because it helps you get through it, your brains are also not fully developed, and it's harder for you to understand consequences and look at long-range effects of things. So it's oftentimes harder to get a young person off of drugs than it is an older person who may have been using for years because of your brain chemistry. Children or young adolescents get addicted much quicker, and it takes them much longer to get off of them once they make that choice because of the lack of development within their brain. So I want you to think, and I don't think they're getting this video to work, but no. But I will tell you that every one of the people that are depicted in this video never in a million years thought their life would take the route that it took. Every one of them will. The kid that was sitting, the larger boy that was sitting on the stairs, he actually went to college in the Upper Peninsula and was a straight-A student while he was there until he couldn't be anymore. He was an athlete. Cody had scholarships to play soccer all over the world and lost all of that. Will has a criminal record now and had a hard time finding a job and had to start his own business as a result of it. Are we good? Okay, we're going to finish the video.
Because I needed them. I had to have them. I went from being, you know, this, what I would think is a good kid that grew up in a good neighborhood, that had loving parents, that never experienced, you know, trauma or neglect or drug abuse, that had a wonderful opportunity at success, that went to, you know, good schools, that could have been a Major League Baseball player. But here I am, like this guy that had all of that, and now I'm a heroin addict, and it lasted for 10 years. 10 years. Homelessness, jails, institutions, overdoses, hospitals, lying, cheating, stealing, just pain for 10 years.
We understand what it means to play, you know, baseball every single day, and how quickly someone can become addicted to these drugs. Baseball inherently is an unnatural sport, overhand throwing and rotational, puts a lot of stress on the elbows, shoulders, joints, hips, knees. One wrong injury, one shoulder surgery, one elbow surgery, all of a sudden, Oxycontin and Vicodin, and you're hooked and you could be out of baseball.
It doesn't matter if, you come from this neighborhood or that neighborhood. It doesn't matter what sports you played. It doesn't matter where your parents went to school. It doesn't matter what neighborhood you grew up in. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. Everything that you learned in terms of morals and values and principles, maybe in your life, or maybe you didn't learn, all that stuff goes out the window because you don't care what you need to do to get another one. You have to have this to function.
You have a duty to your child to make sure you understand what you're handing out to him. Even if it does come from the doctor, you become the conduit that's giving him that substance, him or her that substance. So ask the questions. Is this really necessary? Do you need 60 Vicodin, or can you get away with 3 of them and then take Motrin? Or can you get away with none of them?
Those kids who get an opioid are more likely to move down a path of chronic use. And so I think it is important for parents to always consider how appropriate each prescription opioid pain medication is. And that can be a challenging place for parents to be questioning the physician that's caring for their child or the dentist that's caring for their child, but you certainly have to be your own advocate.
They're not going to probably ask questions. They're probably not going to push back. So they're going to do what they're told, which is written on the prescription. And I think that's another problem that we have. And that's why the parents have to really wrap and engage and let their children know it's okay to question the taking of pain medication and narcotics.
All I know is that there has to be more communication about this kind of stuff, because there's not one single person, if they know this stuff, that has to go down the road that I went down. It can all be avoided. Every day I get some sort of Facebook message or email or phone call or text that somebody I know died from an opiate overdose. And most of them started with a legitimate prescription because of an injury.
I always like to leave you with a takeaway, because people always say, well, what can I do? And each and every one of you has the ability to be a small part of the solution. There's legislation pending right now that would make this mandatory to be played for every parent and every student who plays an athletic sport in school. And I've testified in front of the Senate about this bill, and they like the concept of it, but they keep coming back with, well, you need a female, you needed a person of color. You didn't talk about equestrian sports in it, and they nitpick it to death, and this shouldn't be political. It should be about saving lives. So contact your senator and your representative and let them know that you would like your children to be seeing this, and if your kids, that's something that you should be wanting too, is to be educated about this. Know what you're taking, what the dangers are, so that when you make a decision, you've got the tools to make a good, healthy decision about what you're going to allow to be put into your body. So that's one of the things you can do. The other thing is, we've heard a lot about prescription drugs, and although there is a big push and doctors are doing much better at not writing a lot of scripts, we have those old prescriptions, and Spectrum Hospital, along with FAN, is doing drug take back in the DEA. Make sure you get those pills out of your cabinet. Treat them like they're a loaded gun, and they're not something that you should have in your house. I spoke with a real estate agent recently that told me that they are now calling ahead and telling people not to leave their prescriptions in their medicine cabinets, because people will pretend they're house hunting just to go into houses and look for narcotics, because that's how strong the need is once that you're addicted to these drugs. So be smart and get them out of the house, and not to be a temptation for maybe not your children, but a neighborhood kid or a niece or a nephew that might come over to your house for a visit. There are some really positive, proactive things you can do, and be part of the solution. Go to your fan meeting and become educated about it. And when you leave here tonight, tell other people about what you learned so that we start the conversation. We call this the silent epidemic because there is so much shame centered around the epidemic of addiction and the stigma of addiction that people are afraid to talk about it. And we should be no more afraid to talk about addiction in our family than we are to talk about diabetes or cancer. It's a disease. It is not a moral failing. So please do your part to be part of the change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Davis. You know, our presenters tonight have just been outstanding, impactful presentations as well, and I can tell you that the Rockford Public Schools is committed to this issue and will continue to be. This presentation tonight is being videoed, and it will be on our website under Developing Healthy Kids. For those of you that have friends and neighbors and family members that may want to take the time to view this presentation in the future. Our final presenter tonight, many of you may know Mike Emery. He is a successful business owner over the past 30 years in insurance and investment industry. He's a Rockford community member for over 20 years and currently resides here in Rockford with his wife and youngest daughter, Zena. Mike and Sharon have 4 children, all graduates of Rockford High School. Mike is currently the varsity girls lacrosse coach, a highly successful girls lacrosse program where his teams have won 8 state championships, 7 in a row. He's a member of the Rockford Public Schools Sports Hall of Fame as well, and he's one of the founding members of the Grand Rapids chapter of FAN, Families Against Narcotics. Please welcome Mike Emery.
Thank you. When I coach, one of the things that we talk about is that we're a family. And so tonight, we're going to expand that family, and you're all part of our family, and you're going to hear a family story tonight. You saw a lot of statistics up there from Steve. You saw some information. And I've been in these meetings, and sometimes that can be a little antiseptic, right? It's not in my neighborhood. It's not in my backyard. And then we heard Linda, I won't call her Judge, talk about her personal experience, but that was on the other side of the state. That doesn't happen here. I'm here to tell you it does happen here. It's in our community, it's in our schools, it's in our families. So I want to give you a message, though, tonight of hope, but we do need to talk about the stigma. And that stigma was in me just as it was in Linda when she discovered things. I want to talk about forgiveness, because when that happens, you have to learn to forgive yourself as a parent, as a family member, maybe a sibling, in order to be able to move on and help. Because it's not a problem of one individual. And when we talk about problem, it truly is a disease. So we heard Judge talk about cancer, about diabetes. Think recently what's been going on, and what has everybody been worried about are mosquitoes and mosquito bites. And that's taken over the news, and we've lost some people in our West Michigan communities, but we've lost 5 or 10-fold that number through addiction, yet that's not the number one topic in the news. So we need to be able to talk about it in the same manner, because it's critically that important. Next week, we will celebrate, and I say we as a family. My son will be, to use the word she used, dirty, while he will have been clean now for 3 years. He's a Rockford graduate. He was an honor student. And he was going to join us tonight, but he actually works at the Alano Club, and he's the director of operations there, very immersed in his recovery. And that is a place where there is more recovery programming, actually, and it's in our county, than anywhere else in the United States in one location. So that tells you that we do have a problem here. So 3 years ago, he literally had died in a Rockford home when first responders from Kent County appeared and revived him with Narcan. So, and I do now have a Narcan kit, and I would urge every one of you to have a Narcan kit. It's that critically important. Without Narcan, the story I would be telling would be a much different story. So, stigma. I was angry. I was hurt. Family members were hurt. This was not a new issue, but this was new to us to understand all the signs that we had seen and what were causing these. Now we know, and having looked back, and after being educated, I would have looked at it differently. You heard Judge talk about the weight loss, the sleeping, the isolation, the loss of desire for things that used to be important, like family gatherings and other things. All of those signs were there, but at the age, and he had a 10-year problem before this happened, he broke his wrist snowboarding, and he was prescribed opiates. And that was the start of his opiate addiction. It had been a 10-year struggle. We didn't know it. He had tried to get off opiates himself several times. Couldn't hold a job. And he said in the last couple of years prior to the overdose, turned to heroin because it was readily available and much less expensive. So fast forward to today, that's hope. Why is it hope? Because he's alive, he's immersed in his recovery, but it is like one of those diseases. And we heard Judge say that young man has to get up every day and start his day. She talked about someone who has to first be worthy and start his day and be in recovery. And that's my son. So this is something like diabetes or like cancer, where it isn't all of a sudden now you're clean and you're cured. He will live with this the rest of his life. And he has to treat it just like one of those diseases, because the temptation is there, because these drugs change your brain. When he was in 5th grade, he actually gave the DARE presentation. He was the student selected in his class because he had the most worthy presentation. And as some of you remember, either you've been in DARE, right, or your kids have been in DARE. And so this was something he never thought would be his life. And he would be here tonight, but he's preparing for a banquet tomorrow night at his club. And he had a message for everyone in the room. And the message was, as he grew up, this was never the life that he ever envisioned that would be his life. But for a few decisions and things that happen in life, he now is labeled as an addict and will be in recovery forever. It can happen that fast. He was raised in a good family, in a great school district. He was an honor student. And yet, he also almost died due to drugs. So, the stigma, right? It happens everywhere but not here. Not in my school, not in my backyard, not in my church, not in my community, not in my family. Well, as a Rockford family, it does happen. A young man, and some of you will know the young man and know the family and know the story. After two months after my son's overdose, and my son was incarcerated for a time after that. It's a crime, right? So we helped the police find him. I appeared before the judge and pleaded with the judge to not release him, to not give him bail. because I wanted to make everything as difficult as I could in order for him to be able to recover. But as a family, we were shattered. We didn't understand, and we wanted to blame each other. I cried. I spent a lot of tears. How are we going to handle this? I didn't know where to turn, and there was an article in the Grand Rapids Press, and I happened to call a lady by the name of Jean. And I was the first parent that Fan helped. And I didn't know where to go and where the resources were, but today that's part of the hope. Because of all the work that we've done, there now are resources. There are people and players here. Chuck DeWitt is in the audience. Chuck is part of the Kent County Sheriff's Department. Chuck's people were very helpful. Right? And Chuck and I have spent many conversations. But he's a Rockford guy too, right? It's in our community. So sorry if you wanted to remain anonymous tonight. But you're very important in my life and in my son's recovery and in the recovery of others. So thank you. I had nowhere to go, no idea where to go. All that we had decided in tears with my wife and I is that he couldn't be in our house. But yet, where's he going to go? Because there's no place to go. There's no treatment facilities. There's nowhere to go. So we let him come home under some very guided rules. It was almost like having a toddler, right? And he had to go to meetings. But then he's got to find a job. He's got to find housing. Well, he's got to show up and give a urine specimen every day. So you got to work around that. What employer? There's a stigma. Who wants to hire him? So we had to find employers, and now through FAN we have a number of employers that will hire people that are in recovery so that they can get started. And he got lucky and found his way into a recovery club, and he works in recovery. And many people who are in recovery want to give back and help others. Law enforcement is critically important, and we've become friends with those groups. So where are you going to live? He lived in sober living. How is he going to pay for that? You have to be able to get that started. How is he going to pay for treatment, right? If you don't have any income and you don't have any health insurance, how can you pay for help? So those are all things that are out there and that are all part of the issue. So I had no idea where to turn, and neither did the rest of our family. But Gene had networks, and I was tough enough and with business skills to knock down doors and to not take no for an answer. You heard Judge, it's a very, very similar story. And but for the grace of God and first responders that showed up, my son wouldn't even be on this earth, and his boyhood friend isn't. So it's there, it's an issue, it's a disease. And that was hard for me because I had all of those beliefs. What did I do wrong as a parent? How could this happen? How could he embarrass us that way? All of those things were going through. But as I got out in the community and saw what was going on and saw the numbers of people and saw friends and have seen others have problems. We saw a raise of hands earlier tonight on how many families have been affected. And I'm sure there may have been some that maybe even didn't want to raise your hand. It's hard to go today without being affected by opiates and heroin and all the synthetics that are there. It's scary. And the more you know, the scarier it gets. But again, his message to all of you tonight was that was never his plan, nor did he ever want to wake up and be that. He didn't choose that. But those drugs affected him in that way, and they affect your brain to the point where you choose that feeling over anything else in your world, over family, friends, eating, anything. It's that powerful for those that it affects. And that's no different than why do some of us get cancer and some of us don't? Or why do some of us get diabetes and some of us don't? It's no different. But I had to learn that. And I had to forgive myself for those thoughts and feelings, or I couldn't be his advocate, and I couldn't help him. But I couldn't do it alone. Today there are resources. So I would urge anybody that may be here that either knows of someone or is themselves or their family struggling, or maybe a classmate or a friend. There are resources and there are help. They don't want that feeling, but they don't want to feel the way that they feel when they don't have the drug. It's like being sick because of how it affects them. So today there are resources. Today there is hope. My son is a success story. But tomorrow that could all change. Why? Because there could be a relapse, right? He could be out of that remission. Just like that family member who has cancer could have that relapse or be out of that remission. So he has to check himself every day. That will be his life for the rest of his life. He turned 32 a few weeks ago. So that's a new normal. And they have to learn how to cope all over again, because not only does the brain affect that desire, but it takes away or intercepts some of their coping skills, how they handle things during their lifetime. So he has to learn how to do that all over again. And kids today have a lot of pressures on them, right? All that social media, all that information, all of that stuff, it's a very different world than what I grew up in or what Judge talks about, right? The old, if you've seen an old Happy Days sitcom, that's a very different world than what kids live in today. So there's a lot of pressures. There are different pressures that are there. And it does happen from injuries. That young man who passed away was a hockey player and was prescribed, and that's how he got started with injuries. My son broke his arm snowboarding and had to keep working. He was living in Colorado and had a job, had to keep working or he'd lose his job and his ability to support himself. And so what happened is he took those medications and became addicted to those medications. But he hid it very well, because you can function for a time period. But then it got to a point where he couldn't function, and then the overdose. So it's real. I want you to come away with that message. There's hope and there's help. And not only that, some of the help that's there is understanding it very, very differently today because of people like Judge Davis and Gene and Steve, right? Steve gets it. He doesn't want to put good people away. He wants to put away the people that are supplying the good people with those drugs. That's really the key. So, in closing, I would share that it's here. It's real. It's a disease. Please treat it like that and understand. We need to all work together to remove that stigma and know that there is hope and there can be success. And you have to label that success maybe differently, right? His life plan and his goals might be different, and he's going to take him a little longer to get to some of those places in his life as he works through that. But he's alive every day, and he's happy, and he's impacting society because he's helping other people who are in the same issues of recovery. But it could have been very, very different. And I look back on that and think, what if I would have thought differently of all of this, and what if I understood the signs a little better and a little more? Could it have not gotten to that level where it have gotten to? I don't know the answer to that. But I know what fans' role is in West Michigan, and what I believe mine is if we can save one and make one difference, then it's all worth it. So that's really the key in the message. So The peer listeners are going to join us up here, and I think we're going to answer some questions. If there are questions, we're all going to be available here, both formally and informally, if we want to answer that. And again, thank you to Judge Davis and to Dr. Scheibler for actually allowing this to happen and this discussion to be open and really be a leader in removing the stigma in the Rockford community. I really commend him for that. So.
Thank you, Judge Davis and Coach Mike Emery, for sharing your touching stories. My name is Elsa Donda, and I help lead Peer Listening, which is a mental health outreach and advocacy program here at Rockford. And before we transition into the question and answer panel, I would like to take a moment to let you all know that if you or someone you know is struggling, please feel free to come down to the counseling office and request a peer listener. And parents, if your students are struggling, just please remind them of the abundance of resources that are at their disposal. We want you all to know that you are not alone. Without further ado, please welcome Mrs. Lisa Jacobs and the panel.
Thank you, Elsa. Right now we are going to transition to our question and answer time. We have cards that are out in the audience if you feel comfortable and writing down a question and passing it to the end for our peer listeners. We have 4 peer listeners in the front here that will collect cards if you have any questions. While we're waiting for the cards to transition to the front of the auditorium, I'm going to ask our panelists if there are any additional thoughts that they would like to add here at the end of the program. So I'm going to begin here, and I'm going to put Steve Baker on here at the very beginning.
I would just say that my additional thought at this time, being with these people for the last 3 years and seeing what's going on, there are a lot more available opportunities for people seeking recovery now. The channels to those available opportunities are flowing, and there are more areas you can find them. So if you have a problem or your family is suffering through this problem, I would encourage you to go to FAN's website, come talk to Jean, come to one of the meetings. There are a lot of the panels that will move through those things. There will be more education and a better channel than what Mike suffered when he and Jason went through this with their family. Things are becoming smoother. So I want to offer you that hope too.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or cards? Elsa, could you stand at the mic there and read the question, please?
So this first question is for the judge, and it's, how's your daughter now?
Oh, I'm sorry. I always forget to do that. I think I have a mic here. Can you hear me? No? Okay, no.
It should
It's
be
on?
on.
Okay. Okay, she's really doing well. Just like Mike was saying, every day she has to get up and she has the challenge to remember that she's worthy. That is the part of addiction, that self-forgiveness, that takes a very long time to do. She feels like she's the black sheep in the family oftentimes, and that she's not respected the way other people are. But she has been opiate-free for over 10 years now. But the long-lasting, thank you. But the long-lasting things that go along with this, the self-loathing, I mean, we put down people with addictions all the time, but believe me, they do a number on themselves where there's nothing we can say to them that they haven't already said to themselves. As Mike indicated so elegantly, nobody chooses to live this lifestyle, and they're really ashamed of it when this does happen to them, and it takes a lifetime for them to get over it.
Another question?
Yeah, so there's a couple questions here about Narcan. Are there age restrictions on who can purchase Narcan, and how much does it cost? And how can you tell if someone has overdosed and needs Narcan?
Sounds like a question for the doctor here. No, Narcan you can use on any age. It's a fairly benign drug. We use it in anesthesia all the time for decades. You cannot hurt anyone by giving them Narcan. Do not ever think twice. Give Narcan. There are several ways, either squirting it up through the nose or an injectable type. Most insurances are covering it. Now, if you do not have insurance, it costs approximately $40 out of pocket, but you can get free kits through the health department, through our meetings, and through Red Project here locally.
Additional question?
As far as an overdose, if you come across someone who's likely slumped over, laying on the floor, unresponsive, breathing very, very slowly, if they're blue, clammy, if you can feel a pulse, it would probably be either very, very fast or very, very slow. But if they're unresponsive and you suspect an opioid overdose, go ahead and give them Narcan. We want you to give Narcan first and then call 911 so that it's kind of working. It does take a couple of minutes to work, and be prepared that when people do wake up from it, usually their breathing starts first and then they become very agitated and very, very hard to control. They'll be very combative.
The next question is, how do you encourage someone to admit illness or get help?
How do you convince somebody to get help? Encourage them.
Of course, I get that question again. That is a very, very difficult question. With addiction, as many of you know, the person with addiction does not see that they're causing themselves or others damage. They are in denial, do not have the insight, cannot see the damage and the waves of chaos that they are creating for them and their loved ones. There's nothing you can do other than support them as a loved one to get them into treatment. It's going to be up to them to want to get better, to want to stop feeling sick, to want to stop doing the lifestyle. It's consuming their entire days, waking up, getting the drugs, getting the money, getting the transportation for a couple hours of euphoria, and then waking up the next day doing it all again. People do best in recovery if they're motivated to want to get better on their own. If they're intercepted by the legal system, as Mike's son was, sometimes that's a good thing. Parents in our audience will say, I'm glad my son or daughter was arrested. At least I knew they were safe while they were in jail and I could sleep at night. Being incarcerated gives an option for sobriety for a period of time so that they can basically allow their brain chemicals to allow them to recover enough so that in a week or two or a month you can have a conversation with them about genuinely engaging in real treatment, informal treatment program. The jail program that I set up 2 years ago for a 100-day program allowed for a detox phase and then 3 months of treatment while they were incarcerated. So we used those jail beds as treatment beds while they were there, and then a warm handoff in the community for continuity of care. So that's another good thing that comes out of being arrested and entryway into the legal system. We like to arrange our community resources to meet the person with addiction at the time that they're ready to engage in treatment. And until they're ready for it, it becomes very, very frustrating for a parent or another loved one to try and convince them that they need treatment. You don't see what you're doing to yourself. You're at risk of dying. You're doing all these terrible things. You're stealing, you're lying, you're staying out all night, you're dropped out of school, you're hurting your family members, your poor mother, you're making her feel terrible. It doesn't matter to them at all. They don't see that. And that's part of the disease. That's part of the brain chemistry changes from the drugs that they cannot see that damage. So until they want to get better, there's very, very little you can do as a loved one to get them into treatment. And it
it becomes very, very frustrating for parents over a period of time. When a loved one relapses, we've talked a lot tonight about it's not just a one and done. The risk of relapse is very real for people entering treatment. The average number of relapses is 5.8, so people go from one relapse up to 12. And if they can remain long enough between those relapses, if they can remain alive long enough, what we like to do is string those periods of abstinence together so that their abstinence gets longer and longer. Between the relapses, we find out what they need at that point in treatment and get it for them when those resources are available.
I would add to that, when that individual themselves does not seek treatment or feel the need to seek treatment, that does not mean that that family does not need some help. And so there are resources there as well for family members of someone that is dealing with addiction, and there are a number of resources for that. So that's there too if that's your situation.
Mike, if I could just add one thing to that too. We often hear and we often say, because it's true, if you're not ready for help, it's hard to give you the help that you need. There is also very good social science data saying your exposure to treatment, whether you're ready or willing or not, just exposure to it. And I'm talking about trips to the ER where somebody goes through detox and then they're put in a situation where they see treatment. Doesn't mean that that's the time they're going to take it, but increased exposure does show a good rate of recovery. One other caveat to that too, and I think that Linda and Mike will both agree with this. Sometimes if you are in this position yourself as a family member, as much support as you can offer, as much as you want to do, and as much help as you want to do, perhaps you are not the person that can do that for your suffering family member. And so your access to these programs or these areas and other people to support not just you, but to support your family member that's suffering, sometimes that's someone else that's going to help them do that. And that is, for us as parents, exceptionally hard to admit. But the more you can get out there and get these things, these programs to your children or to your family member, the better off you're going to be and the better off they're going to be, the better off you'll be together when that's done.
Okay, we're going to take just final comments from Judge Davis, and then we're going to wrap up this evening's program. We will collect the cards, and we'll make sure that the questions that have been collected are answered through the Developing Healthy Kids website as well as the Facebook page. Please check in on if you have a Facebook page, the Developing Healthy Kids, for direction and answers to the last questions. So final comments from Judge Davis.
Okay, just in response to that question, I don't want you to leave here thinking, oh my gosh, I can't do anything to help, because you can. You can get help for yourself. The more educated families become for drawing safe boundaries, for setting your expectations, and only supporting recovery behavior will help get your person ready for recovery. If you make it too easy for them, that's called enabling behavior, and I don't like that term because it's a negative term. It indicates you're doing something wrong. But learning to love an addict is very different than loving someone without an addiction, and you really do need to go to support meetings, go to FAN, learn what that kind of behavior looks like. And if you'll start drawing boundaries, I will tell you that that is the one thing that led my daughter to recovery, is the more I tried to help her, the worse it got. I truly almost loved her to death. And when I got help for myself and I started drawing healthy boundaries, not only did I start acting more sane and start having a happy life again, but when she no longer could manipulate me and get what she wanted to help encourage her addiction, she began to change, and that's when she got into recovery. So there really are things you can do. Don't feel hopeless, but lecturing and screaming and yelling and trying to word things a different way will not help. You need to learn to love the person you love in a different way.
Thank you. One last round of applause for our guest speakers this evening. Thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening. That does conclude our program. And again, thank you to our sponsors for developing Healthy Kids and bringing the community education series to Rockford Public Schools and the Rockford community. Thank you.